Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and I am using the Simon Says Stamp Honeybee collaboration for STAMPtember. This is the limited edition Fall Beauty stamp set. So, huge floral set, which of course I am always partial to. So you always get me with a huge floral set. So, I have some B watercolor paper here. Just put it in my MISTI, and then I have this great big large floral image. Just rubbing my fingers on it because it's a brand new stamp, so that kind of enables it to take ink a little bit better. And then I'm inking it up with VersaFine Clair Fallen Leaves ink. Usually I use the Nocturne, which is black, but I really like the look of stamping images with a brown ink, whether you're going to color it with Copics or watercolors and that. It's not something I do very often, and yet it just looks different than black. And because this is a fall image, I want to use fall colors. I thought it would just give it that little extra softness, you know? So stamped it with that VersaFine Clair in the Fallen Leaves, kind of a espresso color almost. And then I am going to watercolor this using my Mijello Mission Golds. And then for my watercolor brush, I'd started with a number 2, and then I switched to a number 4 because I found the number 2 was just too small. And this is a Zen Royal and Langnickel brush. Very affordable, easy to use brush. And for all my watercoloring, I'm keeping it simple. I'm just layering as I go. Starting with just sort of a lighter wash, not filling in every area perfectly. And then while it's still wet, I just keep intensifying the color. So basically picking up more pigment with a little less water each time and just kind of dabbing it on and going along. So nothing too crazy, nothing too difficult. And this actually moves along quite quickly, even though there's a lot, there's a lot of petals and everything, but I just found this was the easiest way to really go along and color in this entire image. So I kept it to a very fall palette. So I did kind of like a goldeny yellow sort of color and did the exact same thing. After I did the leaves, I did this color with a very light wash to begin with, leaving some like parts of the petals completely uncolored to give it, the highlight. And then I would just intensify the color, add a bit of that, and do that usually once or twice just to really intensify it. And then I sort of start really getting creative with the mixing. I was kind of creating like a purplish red sort of color there, using what was already left over and dry in the palette and just reactivating it with water. And with all of this, I found that I would kind of jump around so that I would let one area dry so I don't have colors like bleeding into each other. So I did the leaves first and then the yellow, because if they did, happen to be wet and bleed into each other, yellow and green aren't gonna, make a muddy color. Whereas you start adding this like reddish purple color, and if that started mixing with green, we'd get brown. But again, also, I'm not super worried about it because this is a more fall image. I've stamped the image in brown. If that did happen to happen, it wouldn't really ruin this image. So very easy watercoloring. I will say, anyone who's familiar with my videos, I did struggle with not just stamping this on black cardstock and gold heat embossing it. It would look gorgeous doing that too. So, or do like a really dark brown cardstock, because I've been somewhat obsessed with black and gold and white. I think it's beautiful. But with a fall image like this, you could do like a really, really dark brown cardstock, like Simon's darkest brown cardstock, and then like gold embossing powder. It would look gorgeous. And then add some gold splatter, heat embossing sentiment. You'd be good to go. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked with other card ideas as I'm like editing this video. So I went along and did the red flower, and then I mixed up kind of one of the like mustardy sort of colors in the palette with some orange and a tiny little bit of sepia, I think. And then, did this gorgeous like orange color. Same thing, light wash, and then dab in this more intense concentration of that same color. So after I did that, I ended up doing the exact same, technique, same colors on the remaining flowers. Just edited that portion out because it's just repetitive. And then once these were filled in via the magic of video editing, I went in with just another yellow color, but I added a bit more of the mustard to it to create the shade that I used for the flower centers. So did those as the very last after everything was colored in, painted in the flower centers, and then again, just intensified it a little bit. I added a tiny little bit of brown and added kind of a second layer to give it, again, that little bit of definition. And then I made sure this was completely dry, 100% dry. I used my heat tool as well, just to make sure it was dry before adding any splatter, because I didn't want the splatter to just start, you know, mixing and pooling with everything. And I started with just some brown watercolor, which you don't see very much on video, but you can see it in the finished card, is just that bit of brown splatter. And then same thing, made sure this was completely dry, didn't want anything mixing and whatnot. So after I added the brown splatter, I pulled out my gold Perfect Pearl powder, and I'm just pulling it out of the container with that paintbrush and putting it on a Simon acrylic block. And then once I was happy with the amount of powder, I'm going to add a little bit of water to this. And then once that's mixed up, I'm going to start splattering this onto it, of course, as well. So it gives it that nice little bit of gold splatter. And same thing. It's one of those things that looks very subtle, but then when the light catches it, there's all this just pretty gold splatter across this entire image. So picked it up with the brush, tapped on my fingers, but then I also just flicked the brush against the edge of the acrylic block just to use it all up. Waste not, want not. So got that all splattered, and then same thing. Made sure it was completely dry before I run this through my die cut machine. There is a coordinating die set with this exclusive. You can get just the stamp set, or you can get the stamp and die set for a limited time while supplies last. That's, you know, the STAMPtember collaboration mantra, while supplies last. So I used the coordinating wafer die and ran this through my die cut machine. Nina Marie Trapani did a video on the memory box collaboration, and she did a shaped card with the coordinating die, and I almost copied her. I loved how that looked. It was so fun, and this would have worked just as well, but instead I decided to do just a standard A2 card. But to zhuzh it up a little bit, I put the DECO weave stencil from Simon on my Spellbinders Platinum 6 platform. And then I put some craft cardstock over it, and then the rubber embossing mat that comes with the Platinum 6, a cardstock shim, and then the purple embossing mat, and ran that through the machine. So I embossed that DECO weave stencil onto the craft cardstock. So I just have that nice dry embossed texture that, again, I'm obsessed with that too lately. I just love it. So I embossed that. And then I got some just ivory cardstock that I'd cut to 5.5 by 8.5, and I'm scoring it at 4.25. So this will be a standard A2 size card. But like I said, you could totally die cut a second piece with that large wafer die and create a shaped card. If you haven't watched her video, look it up. It's gorgeous. The coloring, just the shape, everything. I loved it. So I went slightly different route, but again, it's another idea in the back of my head. So for the inside of the card, I took that card base, folded it over so the inside was showing on the outside so I could stamp that large floral image. And I used Delicata Golden Glitz ink. And then while I had that stamp out, I also pulled out a coordinating craft envelope. And I'm just using the stamp packaging to protect that so I can move the stamp without having to clean it off and, you know, not worry about ink smearing anywhere. So I can move the stamp around so I can stamp it onto this envelope. And again, in the video, it looks very subtle, and it is in real life, but the Delicata Golden Glitz just gives it that nice shimmer. You know, it gives it the pattern, but it's not super, super busy, so I can easily write over, you know, the recipient's address, my own address, etc. onto the envelope. But it also, you know, ties it all together. So I stamped that onto the envelope, set that aside to dry. On the inside of the card, I pulled that out again because I wanted to stamp a sentiment from this Fall Beauty stamp set. So I lined up the sentiment, and I'm going to stamp that with that same Fallen Leaves ink that I used on the florals. So I'm going to ink that up, stamp that onto the inside of the card. Once that's stamped into place, I can start assembling my card. Now, I wanted to, of course, add a sentiment to the outside. So I took a little bit of a risk and decided I was going to heat emboss it right onto this floral image. So I used my anti-static powder tool, brushed away the excess, and then I am stamping the sentiment first with that same Delicata Golden Glitz ink. I could have just used clear embossing ink, but this was just sitting here from just using it. And you're not going to really see anything. But I stamped it twice just to make sure I got good coverage. And then I'm coating this with Simon's gold embossing powder. And after I heat emboss this, it's still very hard to see. With all the color and everything going on, it just kind of fades into the background almost. So I could have avoided that by, you know, using like a dark brown embossing powder or a black embossing powder, but I really liked how the gold looks. So to make this pop, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to outline all around the heat embossing. And I started with just a gray marker, but then I'm going to switch to a brown marker instead. I'm just using one of my Cairn Brush Marker Pros, but any water base marker would work for this. I prefer not using Copics for things like this because the Copic will go over the heat embossing, plus it can also pick up melted heat embossing powder, and you can wreck your Copics doing that. So I prefer to use a water-based marker. So I just outlined the sentiment with this. This is a sepia brown marker, and that just like allows it to kind of pop out of this busy floral background. So after I had it completely outlined, I can then finish off and assemble the rest of my card. So I'm gonna adhere the textured dry embossed craft cardstock. I'm just gonna adhere that to my card base with Simon's Craft Tacky glue. I'd cut that down to be just slightly smaller than the A2 card base. And then to adhere the florals, I decided to pop these up with Simon's Big Mama foam tape. And because I wanted to kind of offset this a little bit so you can still see some of the dry embossed background, I just kind of figured out where this was going to sit on my card and then applied the foam tape to those areas because I'm going to cut off the excess here. So I peeled off the foam tape backing and then lined this up onto my card base. And then I'm just going to flip this over once it's adhered and just trim off the excess with scissors so that this will fit in that A2 envelope. So trim off that excess, and then as a final little bit of embellishment, I pulled out some Studio Katia gold crystals and sprinkled those throughout this card here just to kind of pick up on the gold splatter, the gold heat embossing, etc. So I'm going to adhere those into place with more of the Craft Tacky glue, just picking these up with my jewel picker. And once these are adhered, this card and envelope are done. So there will be a link below the video to my blog post. There will be a supply list with links. This is a limited edition stamp set, so it's only available while supplies last. So if you are interested in it, highly recommend snapping it up. Thank you guys so much for watching, for subscribing, for thumbs upping. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all next time. Bye.